It is 2 in the morning in a freight yard outside Omaha. A diesel locomotive idles on a sidetrack, headlights off, windows fogged. Behind the cab, a crew member climbs into a narrow bunk built into the bulkhead, pulls a curtain, asleep within minutes. Across the yard, less than 200 yards away, a hotel sign blinks against the dark, vacant, and unused. The obvious assumption is easy. The railroad is cutting corners, forcing tired men to rough it instead of paying for a bed. That belief is wrong. Many crews choose the locomotive over the hotel, not because they have to, but because it turns out to be the safer, far more defensible place to sleep. Here's what's actually happening. Most people picture rest as a comfort question. Soft mattress, quiet room, controlled temperature, you sleep better, you show up sharper. That logic works for almost every job on Earth, from office work to construction to nursing shifts. It's not the case for a train crew, however, because for them, rest isn't really about comfort. It's about reliability. And reliability is exactly the thing a hotel room cannot guarantee, no matter how many stars it has on Google. A hotel room introduces variables nobody can control from a dispatch office 200 miles away. Unfamiliar locks, hallway noise, ice machines at midnight. A front desk that might route a wake-up call to the wrong room, or skip it entirely because a shift changed at 4 in the morning and nobody passed along the note. Traffic outside a window facing the wrong direction. A fire alarm test scheduled for the exact week a crew is staying over. None of that sounds dangerous on its own, but for a crew running against a legally mandated rest clock, 15 minutes late isn't an inconvenience. It's a documented violation that can shut down a section of mainline before sunrise, and it's the kind of variable that simply does not exist once an engine is the bedroom. That's the part most people miss, the part that changes everything once you see it. The locomotive cab isn't a downgrade, it's a sealed, predictable system built specifically for this. The engine is left running to power onboard heat and air conditioning, what railroaders call head-end power, so the temperature in that bunk stays locked in place all night. No compressor cycling on and off the way it does in a budget hotel HVAC unit fighting a thin wall and a leaky window. The crew sets their own alarm. No phone call routed wrong, no front desk miscommunication, no stranger knocking on the wrong door at 3 a.m. They wake up inside a space they already know, parked exactly where the dispatcher logged them, on a mattress that is the same mattress every single time, in a cab whose noise, light, and temperature profile they have memorized after years of riding the same equipment. And here's the twist that should feel backward, but isn't. The plush option is the riskier one. A bigger bed and a quieter room sound like the obvious upgrade, but uncontrolled variables stack up fast, and on a system where being even 10 minutes late triggers a cascading rule violation, predictability beats comfort every single time. That instinct, more comfortable equals better rested, holds almost everywhere else in life, in offices, in homes, in ordinary travel. Here, on this one narrow slice of the transportation industry, it is exactly backward. Now scale it up, because this isn't one tired guy with a personal quirk. It's structural. American freight rail runs on a network where a single late crew doesn't just inconvenience one train, it stalls a section of mainline. That stalled train blocks a junction. That junction backs up traffic for 2, 3, sometimes 500 miles, because freight rail in the US mostly runs on single track with passing sidings, not the multi-track redundancy people assume from watching subway maps. There is often no parallel lane to route around the problem, no shoulder to pull onto. One bad night in a hotel room 200 miles from headquarters can ripple into a multi-state scheduling failure that takes a full day or longer to untangle, with crews stacking up behind a single delayed train like cars behind a stalled truck on a one-lane bridge. A sleeping arrangement is, quietly, a load-bearing piece of national logistics. That's the hidden systems layer almost nobody outside the industry sees. Federal law, specifically the hours of service rules administered by the Federal Railroad Administration, treats a crew's rest period as a tracked, timed, legally documented event, not a private matter. Where that rest happens isn't just logistics, it's liability. A locomotive bunk sits inside the monitored system, GPS located, time-stamped, dispatcher verified down to the minute, cross-checked against the exact moment the train stopped moving and the exact moment it's scheduled to move again. A hotel room, from the railroad's legal standpoint, is a black box. Nobody can prove what happened inside it. Nobody can guarantee the crew member actually slept, actually woke on time, actually avoided being disturbed by a noisy ice machine or a fire alarm test at 5 a.m. If an accident happens after a poorly verified rest period, that gap in the record becomes a legal liability for the railroad as much as a safety failure for the crew. The locomotive can prove all three conditions automatically without anyone having to ask, which is exactly why dispatchers quietly prefer it too. Which leads straight into the paradox that trips up almost everyone hearing this for the first time. Veteran crews, offered a free, fully comped hotel room, will sometimes turn it down flat and sleep in the cab instead. On paper that looks irrational, choosing a vibrating metal box over an actual bed with actual sheets in a real building with real climate control. But ask a 20-year conductor why, and the answer is almost always some version of the same line. I know exactly what I'm getting in that cab. I don't know what I'm getting in a strange room, in a strange town, with a stranger's wake-up system standing between me and my next shift. Younger crew members coming up through the industry often make the opposite choice at first, chasing the hotel for the comfort, before a single bad wake-up call or a single missed connection teaches them the same lesson the hard way. Under fatigue liability rules, the known quantity wins, even when the known quantity is objectively less comfortable. That's not toughness. That's risk management quietly dressed up as a sleeping preference. And this is where the whole thing stops being a quirky habit and becomes a regulatory fact, because none of it exists by accident or tradition. It exists because of a specific historical failure. Through the 1970s and into the 1990s, fatigue was quietly responsible for a disturbing share of derailments and collisions. Crews working irregular call times with almost no enforced rest tracking, falling asleep at the controls of multi-ton trains moving at speed through the night. Investigators kept landing on the same root cause, accident after accident. Nobody had actually verified the crew was rested because nobody had a system capable of verifying it. There was no record, no proof, just an assumption that adults would manage their own sleep responsibly. That assumption kept failing, sometimes catastrophically, and each failure looked almost identical on paper. A crew member with too little documented rest, operating heavy equipment on too little sleep, with nobody able to say afterward where the breakdown had actually occurred. The pressure from those investigations pushed Congress and the FRA to tighten the hours of service framework over successive revisions, eventually requiring documented, monitored rest periods rather than a vague trust in personal responsibility. The moment regulators decided that where a crew member sleeps had to be provable, not just plausible, the locomotive stopped being a fallback option and became the legally cleaner choice. Now go back to that yard at 2 in the morning because two details from the opening mean something different once you know all this. The hiss of the idling engine isn't waste, and it isn't carelessness with diesel fuel. It's life support for a documented rest cycle, holding the cab climate steady for exactly the hours the law requires. Nothing more, nothing less. Running on a schedule that's effectively dictated by federal statute rather than personal comfort. And the locomotive parked dark, away from the yard lights, windows fogged over, that's not a stalled train or a mechanical failure. That's a working rest protocol, deliberately positioned. Deliberately quiet, parked exactly where the dispatcher's log says it should be, often chosen specifically for being far enough from the switching yard's noise and close enough to the crew's next assignment. Anyone who's driven past a rail yard at night has seen that exact picture and assumed something was broken down. Nothing was broken. It was the single safest moving part of the entire operation, just sitting perfectly still, doing its quietest and most important job of the day. None of this means the cab always wins, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty toward a real, lived trade-off. Real-world practice is messier than the clean version of the story. Vibration from an idling engine measurably disrupts deep sleep cycles. Researchers have tracked this directly in crew fatigue studies. Confined space takes a psychological toll on people doing it night after night, year after year, and rail unions have spent decades negotiating back and forth with carriers over exactly this trade-off, sometimes winning better hotel arrangements and per diem rules, sometimes losing them again in the next contract cycle. On longer layovers, especially in extreme heat or brutal cold where even head-end power has its limits, plenty of crews do take the hotel room, and plenty of railroads now invest in better monitored, closer-to-yard lodging, specifically to close that gap without sacrificing verification. Practice also varies by railroad and by route. A short-haul yard crew working the same town every night develops a completely different relationship to comfort than a road crew stranded hundreds of miles from home on an unfamiliar division. The rule isn't cab always beats hotel. The rule is that predictability and proof consistently beat raw comfort under a system built around legal liability, and that calculus shifts case by case, route by route, contract by contract, decade by decade. But strip away the nuance and the core reveal still holds. The choice that looks like a personal sleeping preference is actually the visible surface of an entire invisible safety architecture built specifically in response to disaster, designed to make fatigue provable instead of merely assumed. What looks like a crew member roughing it in a machine is actually the most optimized, most monitored node in a fatigue prevention system stretched across an entire continent of track, refined over decades through hard, often fatal lessons. The locomotive isn't the downgrade, it's the control variable in a decades-long experiment where the stakes are derailments, not discomfort, and where every detail, the idling engine, the fogged window, the parked position, exists for a documented, legally defensible reason. And once you see that pattern, you start noticing it everywhere else in transport, hiding in plain sight, waiting to be decoded the same way. Airline pilots on long layovers will sometimes skip the 5-star crew hotel for a far plainer one closer to the airport for almost identical reasons. Known timing beats unknown comfort when an entire flight schedule depends on one person waking up on time. Long-haul truckers idle their rigs in truck stop parking lots instead of paying for a motel room a half-mile away, not because they can't afford the bed, but because the cab is the one place they fully control, down to the minute. Cargo ship officers on tight port turnarounds make the same calculation, choosing a bunk on a rolling noisy vessel over a hotel bed on solid, silent ground for a reason that by now should sound completely familiar. Different machines, different industries, the same hidden logic running underneath all of them. When failure is measured in minutes and liability is measured in lives, the system you can verify will always beat the one you merely assume is fine. Somewhere tonight, in a parking lot, a rail yard, or an airport employee lot, an engine is idling for exactly that reason, and almost nobody walking past it has any idea what it's actually protecting.